It was a Friday. Bill Clinton was president of the United States. Because You Love Me by Celine Dion was playing on the radio far too often for my liking. But most important to the story I want to tell, on March 22nd, 1996, a genre took the scene: the survival horror game. Resident Evil, or as dubbed in the Japanese market that originated it, Biohazard, was born. It employed elements of horror that had yet to be taken advantage of in the mainstream gaming culture. But I'm getting ahead of myself. While this may be the origin of the name, the survival horror was seeded in many games that came before. Today, I want to take a look at these games and how they shaped what will be one of the most popular genres for the better part of a decade. To fully understand the beginnings of the survival horror genre, one must look at the contributing climate. During what was arguably simultaneously the golden age and wild west of video games, the 1980s was also host to another cultural phenomenon: the rise of the horror film.
Friday the 13th, Part 3.
And more specifically, the slasher flick. Where the 60s saw the rise of camp horror that drew from classic tales of monsters, the slasher was a relatively new take on horror. Less intimate than the stories of Dracula, villains like Freddy and Jason were ruthless killing machines that stalked their prey. And that last bit is one of the most important factors in the rise and acceptance of the genre, at least in Western culture. The horror climate that people wanted to see changed to situations that were less about grand romantic adventures, instead fixating on a character or group of characters' tale of survival. A common misconception, at least in my mind, is that the horror climate for Western culture and Japanese culture was fractured, with Western cinema adopting a more action-oriented tone while Japanese film took a more psychological approach. And while this is true in terms of narrative, I do not personally believe there was as big a difference between the two tonally. They both fixated on small-scale stories with big, horrific appeal that, again, told the tale of survival. This is very important because if the genre had been any more polarized than it was outside of tone, we may not have seen as large an acceptance of the survival horror genre on such an international scale. Granted, the stylistic elements that can be found throughout survival horror in the games that preceded the genre can be found in stories a fair bit older than the likes of the slasher genre. Many similarities can be drawn to H.P. Lovecraft's work and the narrative elements and character design of many horror games. Some survival horror games have even gone as far as to use the stories as the settings for their games. But what may be seen as the most important aspect of survival horror, the gameplay mechanics, took a bit longer to realize than the setting and tone. An early horror game that played a role in developing some of the more stealth-driven aspects of survival horror was Nostromo in 1981, a sci-fi horror game vastly inspired by Alien. The game had you sneaking through a spaceship, avoiding an invisible alien with the goal of escape. Another important note to take from this game was their use of limited resources required to achieve your goals. Should you not have enough of an item, you would have no choice but to die. This laid the groundwork for the importance of inventory management in future titles. In 1982, we saw the release of 3D Monster Maze, which had the player attempt to traverse a maze while avoiding a T-Rex in hot pursuit. You had no weapon to speak of and had to rely on getting out of the maze to win. The same year, Haunted House for the Atari 2600 released, which featured monsters classically found in horror, like ghosts, spiders, and bats. The game also featured a lighting element on higher difficulty settings where a player must light a match to reveal the area of the map around them. Playing with light and darkness is an element of many survival horror games that can be seen as an incredibly central role to gameplay. It's interesting to see how this concept was played with in the formative years of the genre, as simple as they may have been at the time. Another title of the same year that may have played a role in developing the genre's appeal was Sega's arcade title Monster Bash, that featured characters like Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman. The latter half of the 1980s saw more action horror games take the spotlight, such as Castlevania and Splatterhouse. While these games did not feature many gameplay elements that would have realistically contributed to the survival horror genre, they did a service to the horror game genre as a whole in showing how titles could receive critical acclaim and international popularity. It wasn't until 1987's Shiryu Sensen War of the Dead that a game that could truly be called a survival horror in retrospect hit the scene. The game was marketed as an action RPG, though through the narrative, gameplay, and setting could easily be seen as a survival horror premise today. The player character is a lone SWAT team member who must traverse a monster-infested town to rescue survivors and bring them to a safe zone within a church. The gameplay featured open environments not dissimilar to Dragon Quest while exploring, while employing side-scrolling real-time battles as seen in Zelda 2. The game also featured a limited ammo system, where oftentimes players may run out and have to use either their fists or a knife to battle enemies. The game also featured a day-night cycle that would keep track of the number of days that you had spent surviving. This feature would go on to be more prevalent in the survival and RPG genre as a whole, while not seeing as much use within the survival horror genre. In 1989, however, the game that would have the most influence on Resident Evil and the genre as a whole was released. Sweet Home by Tokuro Fujiwara was possibly the most realized pre-survival horror game released within the generation. This one may be a bit obvious, as Tokuro Fujiwara would go on to be the creator of the Resident Evil franchise, but the features present in this game are like going over a checklist of what is required to be a classic survival horror game. The game used a limited inventory and puzzle system to create tension and immersion. There were multiple characters with their own unique skills and abilities, each with their own multiple character paths, an overarching story that was told mostly through documents found scattered around, multiple endings based upon characters who survived and the paths you had taken throughout the game. These features, while scattered among the games I said led up to the fateful day in 1996, were all together in the same place for the first time. That being said, the game was still a top-down 2D RPG, and the style that many attribute to the genre would not be found until a few years later. 1992 marked the release of Alone in the Dark. While it can be argued that this game was not a true survival horror because of its emphasis on action, it featured some of the largest stylistic elements of the survival horror genre. The pre-rendered backgrounds, the static and cinematic angles of scenes, the horrific take on light and dark. It was the first time, in my humble opinion, that a game was able to achieve a truly terrifying atmosphere. In the following years leading up to Resident Evil's release, there were several other games that in one way or another contributed to the genre at large. Titles like 1994's Dr. Hauser, which featured no combat but put an emphasis on puzzles and horror atmosphere. The game utilized sound and music in a way that heightened expectations in all future survival horror games. But then that fateful day arrived, and the namesake of the genre was used for the first time, spurring several franchises that would eventually become part of a cultural zeitgeist. But that, my friends, is a story for another day.